The courtyard of the military academy shimmered under the late afternoon sun, its polished stone tiles reflecting the heat in waves that made the banners fluttering above look like illusions. Rows of cadets in crisp uniforms stood rigid, their boots aligned with precision, their gazes fixed forward as the sound of drums echoed across the parade ground. At the far end, a black sedan rolled to a stop, and from it emerged General Marcus Stroud, a man whose name alone was enough to command silence. Decorated with decades of service, his chest heavy with medals and ribbons, he carried himself with the certainty of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. His reputation was not simply of a soldier, but of a man who expected loyalty to the chain of command as though it were religion. The cadets saluted in perfect unison as he passed, their arms snapping upward, eyes steady, voices still. But in the third row stood Lieutenant Sarah Hale, her chin slightly lifted, her gaze burning with defiance and her arm rigidly at her side. She did not salute. The silence around her seemed to fracture. The cadets nearest to her felt the tension ripple down the line like a fault line splitting open. A refusal to salute was more than disrespect. It was open rebellion in the most sacred place of order. Stroud's stride faltered for half a second before resuming, but his eyes had already locked on her. He stopped just 3 paces away, his shadow falling across her boots, his voice cutting through the still air. "Lieutenant Hale," he said, his tone calm but edged with steel. "Do you know who I am?" The other cadets felt their stomachs knot, expecting the young officer to crumble under the weight of his presence. But Sarah did not move. Her breathing was steady, her eyes unwavering. She had prepared for this moment, not consciously perhaps but in her bones. Her refusal wasn't an act of carelessness. It was deliberate, born of something she carried like a hidden flame. "Yes, sir," she said evenly. The general studied her, his expression betraying only curiosity beneath the stern lines of his face. The silence stretched, and then his voice dropped lower, meant only for her, though every cadet strained to hear. "Then why," he asked, "have you not saluted your commanding officer?" There were rules in place for such defiance. Disciplinary boards, expulsions, charges that could stain a career before it began. Everyone knew the consequences. The drumbeat faded to nothing, the air thick as though even the wind awaited her answer. Sarah's lips parted, but she didn't offer an excuse, no stammered apology or half-hearted explanation. Instead, she said a single word, quiet but cutting through the courtyard like a blade. It was a word she had carried with her since childhood, a word tied to a truth buried beneath medals and stories, a word that struck deeper than any act of rebellion. The instant it left her mouth, Stroud's posture stiffened. His boots shifted slightly, his jaw tightened, and for the first time in memory, those watching saw him step back, as though her word had unbalanced the ground he stood upon. The cadets glanced at one another, their hearts pounding. They had never seen anyone make the general retreat. The word she had spoken hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore, curling around every ear that heard it though few truly understood its meaning. But General Stroud understood, and that was why he had stepped back, not out of fear of a cadet's defiance but because the name she uttered was a ghost he had buried deep beneath layers of secrecy and command. Sarah Hale had not spoken an insult nor a challenge. She had spoken the name of a village, Raventon. The syllables struck him harder than any bullet because Raventon was not just a forgotten outpost in the eastern hills, it was the place where his regiment had carried out an operation 15 years ago, one that was never recorded in official logs, one that lived only in the nightmares of those who were there. Stroud's eyes narrowed, the faintest tremor passing through his hand before he clasped it tightly behind his back. "Dismissed, cadets," he ordered suddenly, his voice louder than before, though a slight edge cracked through its usual authority. The others hesitated, confused by the abruptness, but the weight of his command drove them into motion. Boots pounded against stone as they marched away, stealing glances at Sarah as though she had turned into a figure carved of myth and danger. In moments the courtyard was empty, save for Sarah and the general, their shadows stretching long in the lowering sun. For a heartbeat, no one spoke until finally he stepped closer again, his voice controlled but darker now. "Where did you hear that name?" Sarah did not flinch, did not look away. "From my father," she answered simply. The words sent another jolt through him, though he concealed it with years of practiced discipline. He studied her face as though trying to map features onto a memory he had worked to erase. "Your father?" he repeated, more to buy time than to seek clarity. She nodded. "He was in Raventon the night your men came. He never forgot what happened. Neither have I." Her voice did not shake, though her heart beat with the memory of her father's broken voice recounting the night soldiers stormed into their town, the fire, the gunshots, the screams of families dragged from homes. To the world, General Stroud was a hero, a leader of impeccable service. But to her family his shadow carried blood. The general's expression hardened, though inside, a storm raged. He had long since convinced himself that Raventon was necessary, that the orders had been justified, that what happened in the smoke and chaos was collateral for the greater good. Yet standing before him was the living consequence of that night, no longer a child, but a soldier who bore her father's truth in her defiance. "You tread on dangerous ground, Lieutenant," he said quietly, menace laced in restraint. "Stories from frightened civilians are not the kind of thing you build your career upon." Sarah's gaze sharpened. "It wasn't a story. I was there. I saw you." The word struck harder than the first. She had been a child, hidden in the cellar, her small hands pressed against her ears while her father tried to keep her silent, but she had seen the flash of boots through the cracks, the gleam of metals and torchlight, the face of the man barking orders as houses burned. The general inhaled sharply, his composure slipping for the briefest moment before locking back into the mask of control. He had not realized there were survivors who remembered with such clarity. He had not expected a child to grow into a soldier who would confront him openly on parade ground soil. Silence stretched again, taut as wire, until he turned slightly as though to end the encounter, but Sarah's voice cut through once more. "I didn't salute you because respect is earned, not demanded," she said, steady but not loud, her words carrying weight in their calmness. "And I will never raise my hand to honor the man who gave the order that destroyed my home." For the first time in his long career, Marcus Stroud felt the iron certainty of his authority bend beneath the truth of another's conviction. The courtyard seemed smaller, the air tighter, and for reasons he could not admit even to himself, he took another step back. General Stroud's silence was not weakness, but it was not strength either. It was the pause of a man forced to confront something he had buried so deeply that even his victories could not fully cover its stench. He turned away from Sarah for a moment, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, his boots clicking against the stone tiles as he moved a few paces forward, as though distance could dissolve the weight of her words. But she stood unwavering, her presence a tether that pulled him back to that night 15 years ago. He could hear the shouts again, the crackle of fire, the confusion when orders turned into chaos and chaos turned into tragedy. He had been a commander following directives from above, but he had also been the one whose voice gave permission to act, and that distinction haunted him now in the face of her unrelenting gaze. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, stripped of the bravado that carried him through speeches and ceremonies. "You don't understand what war demands," he said, though the words felt brittle. Sarah's reply was immediate. "I understand what it destroys." The force of her conviction unsettled him more than any weapon could. She wasn't shouting, she wasn't trembling, she was calm, and calmness was dangerous, because it meant she was certain, and certainty could spread like wildfire among those who heard it. If even one cadet began to question the myth of his untarnished honor, the edifice he had built across decades could begin to crack. He turned back toward her, his eyes sharp again, reclaiming the mantle of authority, but beneath it there was a flicker of doubt. "Your father," he said slowly, "was he the one who spoke at the tribunal years later? The man who accused soldiers of slaughter?" She nodded. "He was dismissed, silenced, called a liar. You made sure of that." Her voice was steady, but inside, the memory burned. The hearings where her father, trembling but resolute, had tried to bring the truth to light, only to be drowned out by polished reports, official narratives, and the sheer power of Stroud's word against his. The humiliation, the threats, the way neighbors turned away, convinced by the propaganda that painted them as agitators rather than victims. Stroud's jaw tightened. He remembered the tribunal well. He remembered the man's eyes, and he remembered convincing himself that crushing his testimony was necessary to preserve the morale of the nation, to protect the image of the army, to shield the war effort from scandal. He had told himself it was loyalty. But now, confronted with the daughter of the man he silenced, the rationalizations rang hollow. "If you think defiance will bring justice," he said, forcing steel back into his tone, "you are mistaken. The world does not change because one soldier refuses to salute." Sarah's chin lifted slightly. "It does when the truth is finally spoken." The weight of her words pressed against him, and for the first time in decades, Marcus Stroud felt as though the ground beneath him was shifting. He had faced enemy fire, he had stood against insurgents, he had walked through minefields with the certainty of survival, but this confrontation was different. This was not about survival, it was about legacy, about whether the truth he had buried would outlast the silence he had imposed. He searched her face again, looking for weakness, for some trace of hesitation he could exploit. But she gave him nothing. Only clarity. Only the steady fire of someone who had lived with scars too deep to be erased by ceremony or intimidation. The sound of distant bells from the academy tower broke the silence, signaling the end of the training period, but neither of them moved. Stroud finally exhaled, a controlled, deliberate breath, and when he spoke, it was quieter than before. "You think you know me, Lieutenant, but you know only shadows. Be careful what you stir. Some truths do not liberate, they destroy." Sarah's eyes narrowed. Maybe destruction is what's needed to rebuild what you broke. For a moment, neither spoke further, and the courtyard seemed to hold its breath. Then, unexpectedly, Stroud stepped back again, just half a pace, but enough for her to notice. To Sarah, it was confirmation that he was not untouchable, that her defiance had cut through armor metals could not shield. And in that small retreat, she saw not a general, but a man running from ghosts he could never truly escape. That night the academy seemed cloaked in a heavier silence than usual, the barracks alive with whispers that darted like sparks from cot to cot. Cadets spoke in hushed tones, replaying the scene in the courtyard, some unable to believe what they had witnessed, others secretly thrilled by it. To refuse a salute was one thing, but to make the general himself step back, that was something none of them had ever imagined possible. And though no one dared speak Sarah's name aloud too often, every whispered account carried her likeness like a figure carved out of iron and flame. In her quarters, however, Sarah sat alone at her desk, the lamplight casting shadows across her face as she stared at an old photograph she kept hidden beneath her uniform collar. It showed her father standing tall beside her mother, both smiling though weariness lived in their eyes. The photo had been taken just months before Raventon burned, before their home turned to ash, before the night that cleaved her life into before and after. She traced the edge of the photo with her thumb, remembering his words as he lay injured years later, telling her that truth was not just a weapon but a duty. She knew her act of defiance today would not go unanswered. Stroud was not a man who tolerated insubordination, and though she had rattled him, he would strike back in his own time, in his own way. Still she felt no regret. The sound of boots in the hallway broke her thoughts. A knock followed, sharp but cautious. She opened the door to find Captain Ellis, her immediate superior, his face lined with tension. He stepped inside quickly, shutting the door behind him. "Lieutenant," he said in a low voice, "do you realize what you've done?" She looked him straight in the eye. "I know exactly what I've done." He rubbed his forehead, pacing once across the room. "You've humiliated him in front of the entire corps. Men have been discharged for less, court-martialed, their records erased. Stroud will not let this go quietly." Sarah folded her arms, her expression calm. "Then he'll have to face me directly. I won't be silenced like my father." Alice froze, studying her more carefully. "So it's true then? The name you spoke, it meant something." She nodded slowly. "It meant everything." For a long moment Alice said nothing, then lowered his voice even further. "I was there at Raventon," he admitted, his eyes darkening. "Not in the village but stationed at the perimeter. We were told it was an insurgent stronghold, that the people inside were shielding rebels. I never saw the orders carried out but I saw the smoke, heard the screams. The men who came back, they were different, shaken, but no one dared question it. Anyone who tried was silenced." Sarah's pulse quickened. She had suspected others carried fragments of the truth, but to hear confirmation from someone within the uniformed ranks filled her with a sharp mix of vindication and anger. "Then you know he isn't the hero they paint him to be," she said. Alice hesitated, then gave a small nod. "But knowing and proving are two very different things. Stroud controls the narrative. He controls the records, the reports, the men loyal enough to rewrite history for him. If you go after him, you need more than courage. You need evidence that cannot be buried." Sarah's jaw tightened. "Then I'll find it." Alice studied her, a flicker of admiration in his weary eyes, but also fear. "If you pursue this, Lieutenant, you'll be putting yourself in the crosshairs of the most powerful man in the army. He's crushed others before. He'll try to crush you too." Sarah straightened, her voice firm. "Then let him try. I've already lived through fire. I won't live through silence." Outside, a storm was beginning to roll over the academy grounds, thunder rumbling like distant artillery. Ellis gave her one final look before leaving, his footsteps heavy with unease. Alone again, Sarah returned to her desk, but this time she didn't look at the photograph. She looked at a blank sheet of paper and began to write. Notes, memories, fragments of testimony from her father, details of Raventon she had carried all these years. If Stroud thought her defiance ended with a refused salute, he was mistaken. That was only the beginning. General Stroud sat in his private quarters that same night, the weight of his medals glinting dully on the shelf behind him, each one a reminder of battles fought and victories claimed, but tonight their shine felt like mockery. He poured a measure of whiskey into a glass and stared at it without drinking, his mind returning again and again to the single word spoken by that lieutenant, the word that cracked through his carefully constructed legacy. Raventon. He had not heard the name in years, had made sure it was erased from records, purged from official histories, reduced to nothing but a rumor whispered in corners too dangerous to acknowledge. Yet here she was, the daughter of the man he had silenced, standing in full uniform before him, refusing to salute, not with arrogance but with certainty. He clenched his fist until the glass trembled, but still he could not bring himself to drink. The ghosts of Raventon were awake again, and ghosts had a way of dragging men down. A knock sounded at his door. Stroud straightened, masking his unease with the rigid posture of command. "Enter," he barked. Colonel Hayes stepped inside, a man loyal to him for decades, his face carved with lines of age and service. "Sir," Hayes began, "there's chatter spreading through the barracks. The cadets are whispering about this afternoon." Stroud's jaw flexed. "They'll forget." Hayes shook his head. "Not this time. They're saying she made you step back. They're calling her fearless. It's spreading faster than we can contain." Stroud's eyes darkened. "Then we'll contain her. She's a lieutenant, nothing more. A career can be ended before it begins." Hayes hesitated, lowering his voice. "But sir, the way she looked at you, the way she spoke, I don't think this is ordinary defiance. She knows something." Stroud's silence was enough of an answer. Hayes studied him carefully, then asked, "Raventon?" The general's glare snapped up like a blade unsheathed. "You will not speak that name again," he warned, his voice ice. Hayes dipped his head quickly, but the damage was done. Even his closest ally had pieced together the ghost lurking beneath the surface. Stroud exhaled, struggling to reclaim control. "This ends now," he said. "Find everything you can on Lieutenant Hale, her record, her connections, her family. If she thinks she can challenge me, I'll remind her who holds power." Hayes saluted, but his eyes carried unease as he departed. Alone again, Stroud finally drank the whiskey, but it did nothing to quiet the memories clawing through him. Meanwhile, Sarah was not sleeping. She sat in the dim light of the archives, having persuaded a young cadet on night duty to grant her access under the pretense of research. The shelves loomed around her, heavy with decades of military history, but she knew the official files would be scrubbed clean. What she sought was hidden deeper, in overlooked corners, in reports dismissed as errors, in logs filed away under obscure codes. Hours passed as she combed through documents, her fingers trembling not from fatigue but from the urgency burning within her. Finally she found something, an after-action report from 15 years ago, heavily redacted, entire sections blacked out, but a single line remained: Operation Raven's End, Sector V, civilian displacement completed. Her pulse quickened. Raven's End. She whispered the name, knowing it was code, and the V could only stand for Raventon. Her father had been right all along. She slipped the report into her folder, her heart pounding, when she heard footsteps echoing through the hall. She shoved the folder into her jacket and extinguished the lamp just as two officers rounded the corner, their flashlights slicing through the dark. She held her breath, pressed against the shelves, listening as they spoke in low voices. "General's orders. If you see Lieutenant Hale nosing around, report immediately. She's not to be trusted." The officers moved on, their lights fading, but Sarah remained frozen for another minute before daring to move again. The danger was no longer theoretical. Stroud already knew she was digging. She slipped out of the archives quietly, the redacted report burning like fire against her ribs. Back in her quarters, she unfolded the page again, staring at the single line that confirmed everything she had lived through. It wasn't enough to prove the truth in a tribunal, but it was the first crack in the wall of silence. She swore to herself that she would tear the rest of it down, no matter what it cost. The following morning the academy was alive with an unease that rippled through every corridor and training ground, though no one dared say aloud what they felt. Sarah walked among her peers with the same measured stride as always, but she could feel their eyes on her, some curious, some admiring, some fearful of being seen even near her. She had become a figure whispered about in corners, her refusal to salute no longer just an act of defiance but a symbol others attached their own quiet doubts to. Yet she knew symbols could be dangerous, because Stroud would never allow her to become one. She carried the redacted report tucked deep within her uniform, hidden from the watchful eyes of officers, but the weight of it pressed against her like a stone, reminding her with every step that she now carried a piece of truth the general had tried to erase. In the strategy classroom that day, as cadets studied battle maps and scenarios, Captain Ellis entered with a stiff expression and announced that General Stroud himself would be observing the session. A collective hush fell across the room as the general strode in, his presence commanding silence without a word. His eyes scanned the cadets, but when they passed over Sarah, she saw the flicker of recognition and tension beneath the polished mask of authority. He stood at the front, his voice sharp, dissecting their tactical responses, pushing them with questions designed to expose weakness. When Sarah's turn came, he stopped directly before her desk. "Lieutenant Hale," he said, his tone cold but steady, "what is the first duty of a soldier?" She met his gaze without hesitation. "To protect the innocent." A murmur rippled faintly among the cadets and Stroud's jaw tightened. "Incorrect," he snapped. "The first duty of a soldier is obedience. Without obedience there is no order. Without order there is no army. Remember that." He turned sharply away, moving down the line, but the words lingered, the contrast clear. To the cadets, it was more than a lesson. It was a duel being fought with ideas instead of weapons, a duel in which Hale refused to yield. After the session ended, Stroud called her aside, his voice low. "Walk with me." She followed him out into the courtyard, her pulse quick but her face composed. They walked in silence until they reached a secluded corner beneath the academy's stone archway. He stopped, turning on her with controlled intensity. "I know what you took from the archives," he said, his voice like a blade pressed against her throat. Sarah's stomach tightened but she did not flinch. "Then you know I found the first proof." He stepped closer, his shadow looming over her. "A heavily redacted report proves nothing. All it shows is that you are reckless enough to steal classified documents. If you present it, you'll be branded a traitor, and I will ensure you are crushed beneath the full weight of military law." His words were quiet, precise, deadly. But Sarah's resolve did not falter. "If that's all I had, maybe. But there are more pieces, aren't there? You can erase files, silence witnesses, rewrite reports, but not everything vanishes. And I will find the rest." For the first time his control cracked. He grabbed her arm, his grip iron. "Listen to me, Hale," he hissed, his voice low but shaking with suppressed rage. "You are playing with fire that will consume you. Raventon is dead, buried, forgotten. Let it stay that way or you will be buried with it." She pulled her arm free, her eyes blazing. "Raventon lives in me. And as long as I wear this uniform, you will never bury it again." For a moment they stood locked in silence, two wills clashing with invisible force, until Stroud finally released a sharp breath and stepped back, the mask slipping back over his face. "You've chosen your path," he said coldly. "Do not expect mercy when it ends." He walked away, his boots echoing against the stone, but Sarah knew she had shaken him again. He would strike harder now, but his very anger proved that fear was creeping into him. As she stood beneath the archway, the storm clouds gathering above mirrored the storm rising between them. She knew the battle was no longer just between a cadet and a general, it was between truth and the silence that had hidden Raventon for 15 years, and she had already decided which side she would fight for, no matter the cost. That night Sarah received a message slipped under her door, the handwriting hurried, almost desperate. "Meet me by the eastern wall at midnight. Come alone." She studied it for a long moment, knowing it could be a trap, but something in the uneven scrawl suggested urgency rather than deceit. At midnight she moved through the quiet corridors and out toward the shadowed eastern wall of the academy grounds where the floodlights didn't reach. A figure stepped from the darkness. It was Captain Ellis. His face was drawn, his eyes darting as though the very stones might be listening. "You don't have much time," he said in a low voice. "Stroud has set things in motion. He's preparing charges against you, insubordination, theft of classified material, conduct unbecoming. By tomorrow, they'll summon you before a disciplinary board." Sarah absorbed the words without flinching. "Then tomorrow the fight begins in earnest." Ellis shook his head. "You don't understand. The board will not hear you. They will read Stroud's report, nod their heads and sign your expulsion, or worse. He has too much influence. If you go in with nothing more than that redacted report, you'll lose everything." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Then help me find something he can't erase." Ellis glanced around, lowering his voice even further. "There was a man, Sergeant Danner. He was part of the squad that entered Raventon. He left the service soon after, couldn't live with what happened. Last I heard, he disappeared into the borderlands. If anyone can testify to what happened, it's him. Sarah's heart surged with possibility. Then I have to find him. Alice gripped her shoulder. You'll never get clearance to leave the academy now. Stroud has eyes everywhere. If you step outside the gates, they'll arrest you. Sarah held his gaze. Then I'll find another way. Alice studied her for a long moment, then pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand. This is all I have, an old address where Danner was last seen. But be careful, Lieutenant. Stroud won't just try to discredit you anymore. He'll try to erase you. He disappeared into the shadows before she could thank him. Alone again, Sarah opened the paper and read the name of a remote settlement near the northern mountains. The journey would be dangerous, but if Danner was alive, he might hold the truth that could finally bring Stroud down. By dawn, the academy was buzzing with rumors of the disciplinary board. Sarah moved through the day outwardly calm, inwardly planning her escape. She knew Stroud would be waiting to corner her in that hearing, to strip her of her uniform and silence her forever. But she also knew that the word she had spoken, Raventon, had already cracked his armor. He was desperate, and desperation made men careless. That night, under cover of darkness, she slipped from her quarters dressed in plain clothes she had hidden away for weeks. Moving carefully through shadowed alleys of the compound, she evaded patrols with the precision of someone who had trained for this her entire life. When she reached the outer wall, her pulse quickened, one last barrier. She scaled it with quiet determination, landing hard on the grass outside, the cool night air rushing against her face like freedom. She turned once toward the looming silhouette of the academy and whispered to herself, "This isn't over." Then she vanished into the night, the folded paper with Danner's address clenched tightly in her hand. Inside his quarters, General Stroud stood by the window, staring out over the grounds, his instincts telling him she would not submit. When word came moments later from a guard that her quarters were empty, his suspicions hardened into certainty. He gave his order with a voice like steel, "Find her. Hunt her down. If she reaches Danner, everything we buried 15 years ago will rise from the grave." His men saluted, but in the pit of his chest, Stroud felt something he had not allowed himself to feel since his youth: fear. The northern mountains loomed gray and jagged against the horizon as Sarah trudged through the dirt path that wound into the settlement marked on Alice's note. The air was thin and sharp, each breath cutting her lungs, but determination carried her forward. Days of travel had worn her body, yet her mind remained sharp, driven by the memory of her father's voice and the weight of Raventon's ashes that had never left her soul. At last, she reached a cluster of weathered huts clinging to the edge of the cliffs, smoke rising weakly from chimneys. She asked quietly after Sergeant Danner, showing no insignia, no uniform, only the firmness of someone seeking answers. The villagers hesitated, wary of strangers, until an old woman finally nodded toward a cabin at the far edge of the ridge. Sarah approached it carefully, knocking on the warped wooden door. For a long moment there was silence, then the door creaked open to reveal a man with hollow eyes, a beard streaked with gray, his shoulders heavy as though bearing invisible chains. "I don't talk to soldiers," he muttered, moving to close the door, but Sarah stopped it with her hand. "I'm not here to command you," she said quickly. "I'm here because I was in Raventon. I survived." His eyes widened at the name, the weariness cracking to reveal something raw beneath. He stepped back slowly, letting her inside. The cabin smelled of smoke and dust, a place where time had stopped. Danner slumped into a chair, burying his face in his hands. "I told myself no one remembered. That maybe it had been forgotten." Sarah sat across from him, her voice steady. "I remember everything. And so do you. That's why you left." He looked up at her, eyes glistening with old guilt. "We were told it was an enemy stronghold. They said rebels were hiding in the homes, that civilians had fled. But when we went in, there were only families, children, mothers, the elderly. We were ordered to clear the sector. The general, he said no witnesses. I followed orders, but I've never forgiven myself." His voice cracked on the last words, and Sarah felt the confirmation strike through her like a blade. Here was the testimony her father had been denied, living proof that the truth had been buried by command. "You don't have to carry this alone anymore," she said quietly. "If you stand with me, we can bring it to light. Stroud can't silence us both." Danner shook his head violently. "He can. You don't know the reach he has. He'll kill me before he lets me speak." Sarah leaned forward, her eyes fierce. "Then let him try. But if we stay silent, he wins forever. Raventon deserves justice. My father deserves vindication. And you," she touched the table between them firmly, "you deserve to stop running." For a long moment he sat in silence, torn between fear and the desperate need for redemption. At last he nodded, his shoulders trembling. "I'll testify." Relief surged through her, but before she could speak, the door exploded inward with a crash. Stroud soldiers stormed in, rifles raised, their commander's orders clear in their hard eyes. Sarah sprang to her feet, shoving Danner behind her as the soldiers surrounded them. The leader barked, "Lieutenant Hale, you are under arrest for desertion and treason." Sarah's pulse thundered, but she stood tall. "Then you'll have to drag me." A harsh voice cut through the chaos, deep and commanding. General Stroud himself stepped into the cabin, his presence filling it like a shadow made flesh. He looked at Danner first, recognition flashing in his eyes, then at Sarah, his expression carved from stone. "I warned you," he said coldly. "This path leads only to ruin." Sarah faced him, her voice ringing with conviction. "No, General. This path leads to truth." Danner stepped forward, his hands shaking but his voice gaining strength. "I'll testify. I'll tell them what you ordered. I won't stay silent anymore." Stroud's eyes blazed, fury and fear mingling in a way that unsettled even his own men. For the first time in years, his command did not feel absolute. Sarah seized the moment. "You can kill us, but the truth won't die here. Others know. Others will speak. Raventon will rise whether you bury it or not." The soldiers glanced uncertainly at one another, cracks forming in their obedience. Stroud saw it too, and his mask faltered. He opened his mouth to order them to reclaim control, but no words came. For once in his long career, silence claimed him. Sarah took a step forward, her voice steady and final. "You wanted obedience. But obedience built on lies is nothing. Today the silence ends." In that moment, General Stroud, the man who had commanded armies, silenced tribunals, rewritten history, took one step back, the weight of a single word and the truth behind it crushing him in a way no battle ever had. The end.